Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again from Robinson Crusoe, starting this time with Chapter 6, After the Earthquake. The very next day after this wall was finished, I had almost had all my labor overthrown at once and myself killed. As I was busy inside the wall behind my tent, just in the entrance into my cave, I was terribly frightened with a most dreadful, surprising thing indeed. Suddenly, the earth came crumbling down from the roof of my cave, and from the edge of the hill over my head, and two of the posts I had set up in the cave cracked in a frightful manner. I was heartily scared, but thought nothing of what was really the cause, only thinking that the top of my cave was falling in, as some of it had done before. For fear I should be buried in it, I ran forward to my ladder, and not thinking myself safe there either, I got over my wall for fear of the pieces of the hill which I expected might roll down upon me. I was no sooner stepped down upon the ground than I plainly saw that it was a terrible earthquake. For the ground I stood on shook 3 times at about 8 minutes' distance, with 3 such shocks as would have overturned the strongest building that could be supposed to have stood on the earth. A great piece of the top of a rock, which stood about half a mile from me next the sea, fell down with a terrible noise such as I never had heard before in all my life. I perceived also that the very sea was put into violent motion by it, and I believed that the shocks were stronger under the water than on the island. I was so amazed with the thing itself, having never felt the like or talked with anyone that had, that I was like one dead or stupefied. The motion of the earth made my stomach sick, like one that was tossed at sea. But the noise of the falling of the rock awakened me, as it were, and rousing me from the stupefied condition I was in, filled me with horror, and I thought of nothing then but the hill falling upon my tent, and all my household goods, and burying all at once. This sank my very soul within me a second time. After the 3rd shock was over, and I felt no more for some time, I began to take courage, and yet I had not heart enough to get over my wall again, for fear of being buried alive. I sat still upon the ground, greatly cast down and disconsolate, not knowing what to do. All this while, I had not the least serious religious thought, nothing but the common Lord have mercy upon me, and when it was over, that went away too. While I sat thus, I saw that the sky was growing overcast and cloudy, as if it would rain. Soon after that, the wind rose little by little, so that in less than half an hour it blew a most dreadful hurricane. The sea was suddenly covered over with foam and froth, the shore washed with huge waves, the trees torn up by the roots. In short, it was a terrible storm. This lasted about 3 hours, and then began to abate, and in 2 hours more it was stark calm and began to rain very hard. All this while I sat upon the ground very much terrified and dejected. Suddenly it came into my thoughts that these winds and the rain being the consequences of the earthquake itself was spent and over, and I might venture into my cave again. With this thought my spirits began to revive, and the rain also helping to persuade me, I went in and sat down in my tent. But the rain was so violent that my tent was ready to be beaten down with it. I was forced to go into my cave, though I was very much afraid and uneasy for fear it should fall on my head. Excuse me. This violent rain forced me to a new work, to cut a hole through my new fortification like a sink to let water go out. Excuse me, which otherwise would have filled my cave. After I had been in my cave some time, and had found that no more shocks of the earthquake followed, I began to be more composed. And now, to support my spirits, which indeed wanted it very much, I went to my little store and took a small sup of rum, which however I did then, and always very sparingly, knowing that I could have no more when that was gone. It continued raining all that night, and a great part of the next day, so that I could not stir abroad, but my mind was more composed, and I began to think what I had best do. I concluded that if the island was subject to these earthquakes, there would be no living for me in a cave, but I must consider building some little hut in an open place. I could surround it with a wall as I had done here, and so make myself secure from wild beasts or men. I was convinced that if I stayed where I was, I should certainly one time or other be buried alive. With these thoughts, I resolved to remove my tent from the place where it stood. It was just under the hanging precipice of the hill, which, if it should be shaken again, would certainly fall upon my tent. I spent the next 2 days, the 19th and 20th of April, in planning where and how to remove my habitation. I was so afraid of being swallowed alive that I never slept in quiet, yet my terror at lying out in the open without a fence was almost equal to it. When I looked about and saw how everything was put in order, how pleasantly concealed I was, and how safe from danger, it made me very loath to remove. In the meantime, it occurred to me that it would require a great deal of time for me to do this, and that I must be contented to run the risk where I was till I had formed a camp for myself and had secured it so that I could move to it. With this resolution, I composed myself for a time, and resolved that I would go to work with all speed to build a wall with piles and cables in a circle as before, and set my tent up in it when it was finished, but that I would venture to stay where I was till it was finished and fit to move to. This was the 21st. April 22nd. The next morning I began to consider means to put this resolve into execution, but I was at a great loss about my tools. I had 3 large axes and an abundance of hatchets, for we carried the hatchets for traffic with the Indians. But with much chopping and cutting knotty hard wood, they were all full of notches and dull, and though I had a grindstone, I could not turn it and grind my tools too. This cost me as much thought as a statesman would have bestowed upon a grand point of politics, or a judge upon the life and death of a man. At length I contrived a wheel with a string, to turn it with my foot, that I might have both my hands at liberty. I had never seen any such thing in England, or at least not to take notice how it was done, though since I have observed it is very common there. This machine cost me a full week's work to bring it to perfection. April 28th and 29th. These 2 whole days I took up in grinding my tools, my machine for turning my grindstone performing very well. April 30th. Having perceived that my bread had been low a great while, now I took a survey of it, and reduced myself to 1 biscuit cake a day, which made my heart very heavy. May 1st. In the morning when I looked toward the seaside, the tide being low, I saw something bigger than ordinary lying on the shore. It looked like a cask. When I came to it, I found a small barrel and 2 or 3 pieces of the wreck of the ship, which had been driven on shore by the recent hurricane. When I looked toward the wreck itself, I thought it seemed to lie higher out of the water than it used to do. I examined the barrel which was driven on shore, and soon found that it was a barrel of gunpowder, but it had taken water, and the powder was caked as hard as a stone. However, I rolled it farther on shore for the present, and went on upon the sands as near as I could to the wreck of the ship to look for more. When I came down to the ship, I found it strangely changed. The forecastle, which before lay buried in sand, was heaved up at least 6 feet. The stern, which had been broken to pieces and parted from the rest by the force of the sea, soon after I had stopped rummaging her, was tossed up as it were and cast on one side. The sand was thrown so high on that side next her stern that whereas there was a great place of water before, so that I could not come within a quarter of a mile of the wreck without swimming, I could now walk quite up to her when the tide was out. I was surprised with this at first, but soon concluded that it must have been done by the earthquake. By this violence the ship was more broken open than formerly, and many things came daily on shore which the sea had loosened, and which the winds and the water rolled by degrees to the land. This wholly diverted my thoughts from the plan of moving my dwelling. I busied myself mightily that day especially in searching whether I could make any way into the ship, but I found that nothing was to be expected of that kind, because all the inside of the ship was choked up with sand. However, as I had learned not to despair of anything, I resolved to pull everything to pieces that I could of the ship, concluding that everything I could get from her would be of some use or other to me. May 3rd. I began with my saw and cut a piece of a beam through, which I thought held some of the upper part or quarter deck together. When I had cut it through, I cleared away the sand as well as I could from the side which lay highest, but the tide came in, and I was obliged to give up for that time. May 4th. I went fishing, but caught not 1 fish that I dared eat. I was weary of my sport, and was just going to stop when I caught a young dolphin. I had made a long line of some rope yarn, but I had no hooks, yet I frequently caught fish enough, as much as I cared to eat. I dried them in the sun and ate them dry. Worked on the wreck, May 5th. Worked on the wreck, cut another beam asunder, and brought 3 great fir planks off from the decks, which I tied together and floated to shore when the tide was in. May 6th. Worked on the wreck, got several iron bolts out of her, and other pieces of ironwork. Worked very hard, and came home very tired, and had thoughts of giving it up. May 7th. Went to the wreck again, intending not to work, but found that the weight of the wreck had broken itself down. The beams were cut so that several pieces of the ship seemed to lie loose. The inside of the hold lay so open that I could see into it, but it was almost full of water and sand. May 8th. Went to the wreck and carried an iron crowbar to wrench up the deck, which now lay quite clear of the water or sand. I wrenched open 2 planks and brought them to shore, also with the tide. I left the iron crowbar in the wreck for next day. May 9th. Went to the wreck, and with the crowbar made way into the body of the wreck, and felt several casks, and loosened them with the crowbar, but could not break them up. I felt also the roll of English lead, and could stir it, but it was too heavy to remove. May 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. Went every day to the wreck and got a great many pieces of timber and boards or plank and 200 or 300 weight of iron. May 15th. I carried 2 hatchets to try to cut a piece off the roll of lead by placing the edge of one hatchet and driving it with the other, but since it lay about 1.5 feet in the water, I could not make any blow to drive the hatchet. May 16th. It had blown hard in the night, and the wreck appeared more broken by the force of the water, but I stayed so long in the woods to get pigeons for food that the tide prevented my going to the wreck that day. May 17th. I saw some pieces of the wreck blown on shore at a great distance, nearly 2 miles away. I resolved to see what they were and found that it was a piece of the head, but too heavy for me to bring away. May 24th. Every day to this day I worked on the wreck, and with hard labor I loosened some things so much with the crowbar that the first blowing tide several casks floated out, and 2 of the seamen's chests. The wind was blowing from the shore, however, and nothing came to land that day but pieces of timber and a hogshead, which had some Brazil pork in it, but the salt water and the sand had spoiled it. I continued this work every day to the 15th of June, except the time necessary to get food, which I always appointed, during this part of my employment, to be when the tide was up, that I might be ready when it ebbed out. By this time I had gotten timber and plank and ironwork enough to have built a good boat if I had known how. Also, I secured it several times and in several pieces almost 100 weight of the sheet lead. June 16th. Going down to the seaside, I found a large tortoise or turtle. This was the first I had seen, which it seems was only my misfortune, not any defect of the place or scarcity, for had I happened to be on the other side of the island, I might have had hundreds of them every day. I found them afterwards and perhaps paid dearly enough for them. June 17th. I spent the day cooking the turtle. I found in her 80 eggs. Her flesh was to me at that time the most savory and pleasant that ever I had tasted in my life, for I had had no flesh but that of goats and fowls since I had landed in this horrid place. June 18th. Rained all day, and I stayed within. I thought at this time that the rain felt cold, and I was something chilly, which I knew was not usual in that latitude. June 19th. Very ill and shivering, as if the weather had been cold. June 20th. No rest all night, violent pains in my head, and feverish. June 21st. Very ill, frightened almost to death at my sad condition, to be sick and no help. Prayed to God for the first time since the storm off Hull, but scarcely knew what I said or why, my thoughts being all confused. June 22nd. A little better, but with dreadful fears of sickness. June 23rd. Very bad again, cold and shivering, and then a violent headache. June 24th. Much better. June 25th, a very violent ague. The fit held me 7 hours, cold fit and hot, with faint sweats after it. June 26th, better. Having no food to eat, I took my gun, but found myself very weak. However, I killed a she-goat, and with much difficulty got it home and broiled some of it and ate. I would have stewed it and made some broth, but I had no pot. June 27th, the ague again so violent that I lay abed all day, and neither ate nor drank. I was ready to perish for thirst, but so weak I had not strength to stand up or to get myself any water to drink. I prayed to God again, but was light-headed. When I was not, I was so ignorant that I knew not what to say. I lay and cried, Lord, look upon me. Lord, pity me. Lord, have mercy upon me. I suppose I did nothing else for 2 or 3 hours. Till the fit wearing off, I fell asleep and did not wake till far in the night. When I waked, I found myself much refreshed, but weak and exceedingly thirsty. However, as I had no water in my whole place, I was forced to lie till morning and went to sleep again. In this second sleep, I had this terrible dream. I thought that I was sitting on the ground on the outside of my wall, where I sat when the storm blew after the earthquake, and that I saw a man descend from a great black cloud in a bright flame of fire and a light upon the ground. He was all over as bright as a flame, so that I could but just bear to look toward him. His countenance was most inexpressibly dreadful, impossible for words to describe. When he stepped upon the ground with his feet, I thought that the earth trembled just as it had done before in the earthquake, and all the air looked to my apprehension as if it had been filled with flashes of fire. He was no sooner landed upon the earth, but he moved forward toward me with a long spear or weapon in his hand to kill me. When he came to rising ground at some distance, he spoke to me in a voice so terrible that it is impossible to express the terror of it. All that I can say I understood was this: Seeing all these things have not brought thee to repentance, now thou shalt die. At these words I thought he lifted up the spear that was in his hand to kill me. No one that shall ever read this account will expect that I should be able to describe the horrors of my soul at this terrible vision. Nor is it any more possible to describe the impression that remained upon my mind when I awakened and found that it was but a dream. June 28th. I was somewhat refreshed with the sleep I had had, and the fit had entirely passed off, so I got up. I thought that the ague would return again next day, and that now was my time to get something to refresh and support myself when I should be ill. The first thing I did was to fill a large square case bottle with water and set it upon my table in reach of my bed. Then I got a piece of the goat's flesh and broiled it on the coals, but could eat very little. I walked about, but was very weak, and withal very sad and heavy-hearted under a sense of my miserable condition, dreading the return of my distemper the next day. At night I made my supper of 3 of the turtle's eggs, which I roasted in the ashes and ate, as we call it, in the shell. This was the first bit of meat I had ever asked God's blessing on as I could remember in my whole life. After I had eaten, I tried to walk, but I found myself so weak that I could hardly carry the gun, for I never went out without that. I went but a little way and sat down upon the ground, looking out upon the sea, which was very calm and smooth. After a time I arose, feeling very pensive and sad, and walked back to my retreat. I went up over my wall as if I had been going to bed, but my thoughts were sadly disturbed, and I had no inclination to sleep, so I sat down in my chair and lighted my lamp, for it began to be dark. I took up the Bible and opened it casually. The first words that occurred to me were these: "Call on me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me." The words were very apt to my case and made some impression upon my thoughts at the time of reading them, though not so much as they did afterwards. As for being delivered, the word had no sound, as I may say, to me. The thing was so remote, so impossible in my apprehension of things, that I began to say as the children of Israel did when they were promised flesh to eat, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness?" So I began to say, Can God himself deliver me from this place? And as it was not for many years that any hope appeared, this occurred very often to my thoughts. However, the words made a very great impression upon me, and I mused upon them very often. It now grew late, and so I left my lamp burning in the cave, lest I should want anything in the night, and went to bed. Before I lay down, I did what I never had done in all my life. I knelt down and prayed to God to fulfill the promise to me that if I called upon him in the day of trouble, he would deliver me. After my broken and imperfect prayer was over, I went to bed and fell into a sound sleep, and waked no more till noon the next day. Nay, to this hour I am partly of the opinion that I slept all the next day and night, until almost 3 the day after. For otherwise I knew not how I should lose a day out of my reckoning in the days of the week, as it appeared some years after I had done. If I had lost it by crossing and recrossing the line, I should have lost more than 1 day, but certainly I lost a day in my account, and never knew how. At any rate, when I waked, I found myself exceedingly refreshed, and my spirits lively and cheerful. When I got up, I was stronger than I was the day before, and my stomach better, for I was hungry. In short, I had no fit the next day, but continued much better. This was the 29th. The 30th was my well day, of course, and I went abroad with my gun, but did not care to travel too far. I killed a seafowl or 2, something like a brand goose, and brought them home, but was not very eager to eat them, so I ate some more of the turtle's eggs, which were very good. However, I was not so well the next day, which was the 1st of July, as I had hoped I should have been, for I had a little spell of the cold fit, but it was not much. July 3rd. I did not have another fit, though I did not recover my full strength for some weeks after. While I was thus gathering strength, my thoughts ran exceedingly upon the scripture, "I will deliver thee." The impossibility of my deliverance lay much upon my mind, to bar my ever expecting it, but as I was discouraging myself with such thoughts, it occurred to my mind that I poured so much on my deliverance from the main affliction that I disregarded the deliverance I had received. I was, as it were, made to ask myself such questions as these: Have I not been delivered, and wonderfully too, from sickness, and from the most distressed condition that could be, that was so frightful to me? What notice had I taken of it? Had I done my part? God had delivered me, but I had not glorified him. That is to say, I had not owned and been thankful for that as a deliverance. How could I expect greater deliverance? This touched my heart very much, and immediately I knelt down and gave God thanks aloud for my recovery from my sickness. July 4th. In the morning I took the Bible, and beginning at the New Testament, I began seriously to read it, and imposed upon myself to read a while every morning and every night, not tying myself to the number of chapters, but as long as my thoughts should engage me. It was not long after I set seriously to this work that I found my heart more deeply and sincerely affected with the wickedness of my past life. Now I began to construe the words mentioned above, "Call on me, and I will deliver thee," in a different sense from what I had ever done before. Then I had no notion of anything being called deliverance, but my being delivered from the captivity I was in, for though I was Then I had no notion of anything being called deliverance but my being delivered from the captivity I was in, for though I was indeed at large in the place, yet the island was certainly a prison to me, and that in the worst sense in the world. Now I learned to understand the words in another sense. I looked back upon my past life with such horror, and my sins appeared so dreadful, that my soul sought nothing of God but deliverance from the load of guilt that bore down all my comfort. As for my solitary life, it was nothing. I did not so much as pray to be delivered from it, or think of it. It was all of no consideration in comparison with this. And I add this part here, to hint to whomever shall read it, that whenever they come to a true sense of things, they will find deliverance from sin as a much greater blessing than deliverance from affliction. But leaving this part, I return to my journal. My condition began now to be, though not less miserable as to my way of living, yet much easier as to my mind. My thoughts were directed by a constant reading of the Scripture and praying to God to things of a higher nature. I had a great deal of comfort within, which till now I knew nothing of. Also, as my health and strength returned, I bestirred myself to supply everything that I wanted and make my way of living as regular as I could. From the 4th of July to the 14th, I was chiefly employed in walking about with my gun in my hand, a little at a time, as a man does who is gathering up his strength after a fit of sickness, for it is hardly to be imagined how low I was and to what weakness I was reduced. I learned from it this, in particular, that being abroad in the rainy season was the most injurious thing to my health that could be, especially in those rains which came attended with storms and hurricanes of wind. As the rain which came in the dry season was always most accompanied with such storms, so I found this rain was much more dangerous than the rain which fell in September and October. I had been now in this unhappy island above 10 months. All possibility of deliverance from this condition seemed to be entirely taken from me, and I firmly believed that no human person had ever set foot upon that place. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 7. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.